The committee will come to order. The committee meets today to consider House Resolution 4874, the Scrub Act, House Resolution 5170, the Federal Records Accountability Act of 2014, House Resolution 5169, the Senior Executive Service Accountability Act, and House Resolution 24, the Federal Reserve Transparency Act of 2013, which hopefully will be amended to 2014. We are also marking up an oversight report entitled Pseudo-Classification of Executive Branch Documents, Problems with the Transportation Security Administration's Use of the Sensitive Security Designation, or SSI, and several poster namings. The Chairman will have, by unanimous consent, may call a recess at any time. I would announce that we likely are going to have votes within the next 30 minutes. We will recess and will come back immediately following any votes. The committee will now consider House Resolution 4874, the Scrub Act of 2014. The clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 4874, a bill to provide for the establishment of a process for the review of rules and sets of rules and for other purposes.
Without objection, H.R. 4874 will be considered as read and open for any amendment at any point. You have the bill before you in your packets. I now recognize myself for a short opening statement. H.R. 4874, searching for and cutting regulations that are unnecessary, burdensome act, or the Scrub Act, was introduced by Representative Jason Smith of Missouri in June. It was referred to committee along with the Committees of Judiciary and Appropriations. The Committee on Oversight and Government Reform has primary role on this bill as on other legislation concerning the regulatory review process. The Retrospective Regulatory Review Commission is a solution to the burden of regulatory accumulation that has been discussed by this committee throughout my chairmanship. Members on both sides realize that the regulations accumulate but are seldom withdrawn. We have held numerous hearings on how the excess and growing regulatory burden slows economic growth and hurts small businesses. Small business owners, regulatory experts, and former government officials have come before this committee to explain how the broken regulatory system piles regulations one after another on the economy. The Scrub Act provides a way for an impartial commission of experts to assist Congress in clearing away the underbrush of overly burdensome and unnecessary regulations, while preserving for lawmakers the final say in whether a Commission's recommendations merit action. I support the bill. I urge support. This is not a new concept. This is a concept that has been done both at the State level and in other countries. More importantly, or most importantly, this is an example of getting rid of low-hanging fruit for many years to come. If, over the years, we reduce regulation while adding new regulation, there may someday be a shortage of old and antiquated regulation. But I can assure our members on both sides of the aisle, as of today, there is no such threat and none for the foreseeable future. With that, I recognize Mr. Cummings for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I strongly oppose H.R. 4874. This bill establishes a bureaucratic, unelected commission that would have unprecedented authority, and it creates unreasonable and dangerous restrictions on public protections. I understand that Representative Collins will be offering a substitute amendment, so I will wait until we debate that amendment to offer my specific critiques of that legislation. I would like to point out that this bill is another in a long line of attempts by House Republicans to roll back public safety and public health protections. The House of Representatives has voted 509 times to block environmental protections since the Republicans took the majority in 2011. And that's 509 times blocking environmental protections that go to the safety and health of our constituents. If this bill goes to the floor, it will be 510. So I urge the members to oppose the bill.
Thank you. Whoops. Thank you. I'll hold the record open till the end of the day, so any member who wishes to submit an opening statement may do so in writing. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of substitute.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read and original text and read as original text for purposes of the amendment. The text has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. The clerk will please designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4874, offered by Mr. Collins of Georgia.
Thank you. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized to explain his amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. And again, here we start off again in looking at ways that we can undo burdens, undo things that are just on the books, not useful, as I will talk about in just a moment. But also, starting this off, I just have to say that, again, I'm a Republican. I am from Northeast Georgia, and I do like to breathe clean air. I do like to have clean water. This is just amazing that the only arguments that we ever have about cutting back regulations is that we're destroying or putting the public safety at risk. That is just rhetoric that needs to be, frankly, left out. And I appreciate the ranking member, but this is a different aspect that we need to talk about. The regulatory act basically has accumulated a significant problem in the Federal Government. Year after year, Federal agencies add regulation after regulation, piling it on top of the already complex and crowded regulatory system. Study after study, including the 2013 study from the Journal of Economic Growth, found that regulatory accumulation slowed economic growth by an average of 2% a year from 1949 to 2010. Competitive Enterprise Institute, regulatory compliance costs the economy more than $1.8 trillion, averaging $15,000 per household. 2013, Progressive Policy Institute explained in this way. It said the natural accumulation of Federal regulation over time imposes an unintended but significant cost. We need to clean up this burdensome regulatory accumulation, and H.R. 4874, introduced by my friend from Missouri, Congressman Smith, will help the Federal Government accomplish this important objective. The Scrub Act establishes a bipartisan, impartial, retrospective regulatory review commission to conduct a comprehensive review of the Federal regulatory system. It will be charged with the goal of reducing regulatory costs to the economy by 15%, and the commission would identify outdated, obsolete, and unnecessary regulations that should be repealed or amended. It is important to note that this is not a new or partisan concept. In fact, in 1978, a gentleman from my home state, President Jimmy Carter, issued an executive order requiring agencies to periodically review their existing regulations to determine whether they are achieving the policy goals. What a novel thought. And every president since has required some level of retrospective regulatory self-review by agencies. In fact, even President Obama has issued 3 executive orders on regulatory reviews requiring agencies to develop retrospective review plans and to set priorities in implementing the review. Accordingly, however, American Action Forum regulatory changes attributed to the regulatory review by the Obama administration have actually resulted in $10.2 billion of new net cost. This administration has also added $1.5 billion additional hours of regulatory compliance paperwork burdens since the President issued the retrospective review executive orders. The core problem is self-review. Federal agencies are tasked with looking back at their own regulations to assess whether they are still valid or important today. In 2007, the GAO studied Federal agency retrospective regulatory self-review and found several barriers to effective review, including competing priorities, constrained resources, and lack of transparency and public participation. However, agencies conducting a limited number of retrospective regulatory self-reviews, when they did, 90% of the reviews led agencies to revise, clarify, or eliminate regulatory text. GAO asked that a panel of 9 regulatory agencies about this process. The agencies all said centralized review process and interdepartmental working groups were essential to this working properly. The Scrub Act establishes a centrally coordinated review process needed to conduct an effective and comprehensive retrospective regulatory review, needed in the Federal Government while also removing the inherent conflict of self-review. The Commission will be made up of regulatory experts chosen on a bipartisan basis. They will take a government-wide look at the regulatory system, which will allow for impartial and wide-ranging look at outdated and necessary regulations. And they will use the following criteria: whether the regulation has been rendered unnecessary, obsolete, considered advancements in technology as other relevant factors, the cost of the regulation has been justified to the benefits, and where regulation overlaps, duplicates, or conflicts with other government regulations, and whether the regulation is excessively burdensome as compared to alternatives. Upon enactment, the joint resolution of approval, agencies would be required to repeal some regulations that have been identified as appropriate for immediate action. Other regulations would be subject to an initiative regulatory cut-go procedure. The cut-go process gives agencies flexibility as to how to prioritize regulatory elimination by allowing them to choose which regulations need to be repealed or amended and at what time. The only limitation being that new regulations must not be promulgated until equally costly regulations identified by the Commission are repealed. There are many things that this does. What it does not, the amendment in the nature of substitute makes minor technical amendments and clarifies some important requirements for record keeping and transparency. The transparency requirements are important, and so that we can fully and effectively analyze the recommendations for regulatory improvement. One more thing about the amendment is it required the agencies submit requested information as soon as possible, but no later than 2 weeks from the date of the request. This is something we've had to deal with in the past. I think the Scrub Act is a wonderful step forward in dealing with this, and doing so is something this committee needs to, and I would urge all of my colleagues to support passage of this act, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else wish to speak on the bill? The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly oppose the legislation. The amendment and the underlying bill establishes an unnecessary bureaucracy with dangerously broad authorities to subpoena individuals and to restrict agency efforts to protect the public. President Obama acknowledged the need to conduct retrospective reviews of rules when he issued Executive Order 13563 in January of 2011. The Executive Order required agencies to create plans for reviewing existing rules in order to repeal or modify rules that are ineffective or excessively burdensome. The President issued another Executive Order on May 10, 2012, that required agencies to solicit public comments on rules in need of review. Executive Order 13610 also required agencies to report to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs on their retrospective reviews of rules. Under the President's direction, agencies are already conducting reviews of their rules. Congress does not need to create a new bureaucratic body to do what agencies are already doing, but that is exactly what this bill would do. This legislation would establish a 9-person commission to review existing agency rulemaking in order to recommend rules that the Commission believes should be repealed. The President would appoint members to the Commission based on lists provided by the majority and minority leaders in the House and the Senate. The Congressional Research Service has indicated that requiring the President to choose from a list of names provided by Congress may violate the Appointments Clause of the Constitution. This new Commission would have the authority to subpoena witnesses and documents. The bill says, and I quote, "The attendance of witnesses and the production of evidence may be required from any place within the United States at any designated place of hearing within the United States." End of quote. Mr. Chairman, this is an extraordinary authority that even Federal Inspectors General do not have. This new commission would be funded under this bill by robbing the budgets of other agencies. Every rulemaking agency would be required to provide up to 1% of their unobligated funds, or $25 million, whichever is greater. This would include the Department of Defense, Department of Veterans Affairs, the Small Business Administration. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. Mr. Chairman, how much money does this Commission need? The Commission would recommend rules that it believes should be repealed based on the methodology created by the Commission and based on any criteria the Commission devises. The Commission would create a list of rules for agencies to use as part of a new, quote, regulatory cut-go, end of quote, requirement. Under this legislation, when an agency issues a new rulemaking, the agency would also have to repeal a rule from a list created by the new Commission in order to offset the cost of the new rule. The estimated savings from repeal would be based on savings estimates created by the Commission rather than a cost estimate from the agency responsible for implementing the rule. This is an important point because the agency that is responsible for implementing the rule would have access to information about the benefits of the rule that would be lost by repealing it. There is no exception anywhere in the bill for rules issued to protect national security, public health, or the economy. On July 21, 2014, Citizens for Sensible Safeguards, a coalition of over 70 consumer, good government, and public interest groups, sent a letter to the committee opposing the legislation. I ask unanimous consent to put that letter in the record.
Without objection, we'll be delighted to have it in the record.
And here's just part, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Here's just part of what the letter said, and I quote, "This complex bill would establish a new bureaucracy empowered to dismantle long-established public health and safety standards and would make it significantly more difficult for Congress and Federal agencies to implement much-needed protections in the future." With that, Mr. Chairman, I oppose the legislation.
I thank the gentleman. I'll recognize himself very briefly. I support the legislation. I find it an interesting anomaly that Congress has created countless agencies, including the IRS, the FEC, the FTC, the FAA, and the list goes on. Each of these agencies, virtually all of these agencies, have rulemaking authority, which means they get to make laws. So we have created agencies that never need to come back to Congress and can make laws. And yet, when we talk about creating an independent commission charged under the executive branch to take funds and a very small amount and independently evaluate both the gain and the loss of new regulations and to, in fact, create a balance, something that all the way back to President Jimmy Carter has been supported and, as the ranking member said, supported twice in executive orders by the administration. The idea that we would create an entity to do something overseeing the entities we created seems interesting, that it's somehow unfair, capricious, and unwarranted. The fact is the ranking member appropriately did say that IGs don't have the same authority. That's true. I would seek to have IGs have the authority to go government-wide and not only their own employees. I would seek to have the IGs go after people who resign or retire and not just those currently working. But they don't have that authority. They don't even, with one exception, have subpoena authority. So to take the IGs who are under-equipped and use them as an example begs the question of how many agencies, including the FTC, including DOJ and others, do have wide sweeping ability to issue subpoenas, to go anywhere and compel anyone, and yet all we are talking about is an agency of the executive branch overseen by the President being able to meet a worthy goal of having each new regulation evaluated for its cost and look for offsets in outdated regulations, of which I know both sides of the aisle agree there are many. And with that, again, I support this legislation. I thank the gentleman from Georgia for his worthy amendment, and I yield back. Does any other member wish to speak on the amendment? If there is no further discussion, who has an amendment? The clerk will.
Chairman, I have an amendment of the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment. Wait a second here.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 4874, offered by Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
Mr. Chairman, I ask
the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment would provide an exception to the regulatory cut-go provision in the underlying bill for rules that are aimed at protecting national security, the economy, the environment, the health or safety of children, senior citizens, members of the armed forces, or veterans. Mr. Chairman, the underlying bill has no exceptions for rules that agencies issue in response to national security threats or to protect against public health safety threats. The recent chemical spill in West Virginia highlighted the need for agencies to be able to issue rules to protect public safety and the environment. There are many examples of necessary rules that, under this bill, can be jeopardized by the bill's requirement that an agency sacrifice an important existing rule in order to issue a new one. For example, the Department of Defense currently has a pending rulemaking on background checks for employees of DOD child care facilities. Under this bill, DOD would have to sacrifice a rule chosen by a nine-person commission in order to adopt a new rule protecting the children of our service members from pedophiles. This amendment would exempt protections like the DOD from the bill's cut-go requirements. I urge the committee to adopt this amendment, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I oppose the gentleman's amendment. First, on the premise that the Commission would decide what needed to be cut. That's not true. Second of all, the Commission doesn't even go into effect until after it produces a list of proposed reductions. But having said that, I primarily oppose the gentleman's amendment because, in fact, it eliminates the bill. It totally guts it to where, in fact, nothing would fall, no regulation that I can think of would fall outside of the gentleman's amendment. As we all know, terms like economy, environment, health, safety of children, senior citizens, members of the armed forces or veterans, or, in fact, national security. When you put all that together, every single regulation falls somewhere within one of those definitions. Therefore, I oppose it because it is clearly overly broad and would simply eliminate any use whatsoever. I will not have a commission formed for the purposes of doing nothing. With that, I yield back. The question, if there is no further members seeking recognition, the question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland. All those in favor,
recorded vote on that, please.
Let me finish first. Signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the Chair, the noes have it. The noes have it.
Ask for a recorded vote.
A roll call vote being demanded will be, pursuant to the committee rules, will be postponed, and as we will roll all of them for the final vote. Are there any further amendments at this time? Seeing none. Pursuant to the rule with a pending vote, no further amendments being offered, we will suspend further debate on this and return to it at the time of the recorded vote, which I do expect at this time to be after the 2 o'clock vote, but we'll keep you informed.
Mr. Chairman, we'll have a recorded vote on the final two.
Right. Since there are no further amendments, we will have a vote on your amendment, a vote on Mr. Collins' substitute, and then a vote on passage.
Very well. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would suspect they'll all be recorded.
Yes.
The committee will now consider H.R. 5170, the Federal Records Accountability Act of 2014, one that I believe will be much more favored by both sides. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 5170, a bill to improve Federal employee compliance with the Federal and presidential record-keeping requirements and for other purposes.
Without objection, H.R. 5170 will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. The text has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. I'll now recognize my first opening statement on this. A necessary part of a democratic government is transparency. The public has a right to know the actions that their government takes on their behalf. Congress has enacted a series of laws enshrined in the principle in this statute, including the Freedom of Information Act, the Federal Records Act, and, in fact, ultimately, the Presidential Records Act. We have been reminded recently of the importance of the compliance of the Federal Records Act. The archivist testified before this committee that the IRS failed to follow the Federal Records Act with respect to Lois Lerner and perhaps others. This bill injects greater accountability into Federal records law. It ensures that Federal officials cannot use private email correspondence as a way of conducting official business below the radar in violation of the Federal Records Act. It ensures the Federal employees found to have intentionally destroyed Federal records may be removed from their jobs, and I repeat, only if they intentionally destroy. It requires agencies to disclose on their websites when records have been or are likely to be lost, so that the public and transparency groups may be made aware. And it requires that each agency designate one of its senior officials as responsible for records management. This will allow Congress and the public to hold a specific agency official responsible for record-keeping compliance. I would like to thank Mr. Meadows for introducing this bill, and I urge my colleagues to support it and, I believe, possible amendments. And with that, I recognize Mr. Cummings to make his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by thanking you and Representative Meadows for your willingness to work with me on this bill. You and your staff have been very cooperative in addressing my concerns. Transparency is a bipartisan issue the public has to have access to government information in order to hold the government accountable for its actions and inactions. For that reason, I introduced H.R. 1234, the Electronic Message Preservation Act, in March of 2013. That bill would require agencies to preserve emails records electronically. It would also require the White House to have records management controls in place to ensure that emails that are presidential records are preserved electronically. I plan to offer an amendment to add requirements of H.R. 1234 to this bill. Mr. Chairman, this bill provides procedures for agencies to follow if an employee intentionally destroys records. I appreciate the changes you made to the bill to ensure that employees have the same due process rights that they have under current law. The important change that is made by this bill is to require the head of an agency to suspend an employee if the agency's Inspector General finds the employee willfully and unlawfully concealed or destroyed a Federal record. This bill would also strengthen language previously passed by this committee related to the use of personal email accounts by White House and agency employees. I have one remaining concern with the bill. As it is currently drafted, it attempts to restrict the manner in which the President and Vice President create records. The bill says that the President, Vice President, or a covered employee may not create or send a presidential or vice presidential record using a non-official electronic messaging account unless the President, Vice President, or covered employee takes certain steps. Those steps include copying an official email account, forwarding a copy of the email to an official account, or printing the email and properly archiving it. I don't believe that there is a problem with prescribing these actions for Federal employees. I am concerned, however, that the bill may cross the line when it prescribes how the President and the Vice President can create a record. The Presidential Records Act already requires the President, the Vice President, and their immediate staff to preserve their records. I think we should just make sure that we are not treading too far in the requirements of the President and the Vice President. Mr. Chairman, will you agree to evaluate that issue further before bringing this bill to the floor? I intend to support this bill, and I hope that the Chairman will continue to take a bipartisan approach as this bill moves through the process.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course.
I want to share the gentleman's concern and want to make sure we get the questions of the President, Vice President properly analyzed. And they are different. My understanding is that the Vice President falls much more under the rules of the Senate in his capacity as not the President, if you will. I note that the current occupant of the White House, President Obama, had his BlackBerry taken away from him at one point because of concerns of leaked data. And there's a real question about whether or not the President has any right or authority to use a private email, that in fact the security questions in a private email are separate. Notwithstanding that, it's our intention to go forward, consult with the White House to see if we can't find mutually agreeable language that does not unfairly restrict the President or violate the Constitution, but recognize that in fact we may be arguing over a point that has long since been decided by the President and his security team to be something that they want to do. So with all hope that we can look at each of these in their own way and work with the White House and do it in an expeditious fashion, I pledge to do so.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I just want to remind all of us that we are looking far into the future, and we're going to have presidents who are of both parties. And I just think that we just want to try to be careful with that, that's all.
And I couldn't agree with the gentleman more that we want to make sure, particularly as to POTUS, that we in fact do not adversely cross the constitutional line, and we will seek to find common language as to that, as I believe the Presidential Records Act anticipates that it is, in the case of the Presidential Records Act, the office of the President, but not the President, responsible for capturing that information, and we will seek to find acceptable language.
All right, thank you.
I would hold the record open until the end of the day for any members who want to submit opening statements, in addition to the author of the bill, who is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your eloquent words as you discuss the merits of the Federal Records Accountability Act. It's essential that Federal agencies and employees within These agencies are responsible for carrying out our nation's law, that they comply with the Federal Records Act and the Presidential Records Act that you were just discussing. We must ensure that the Federal Government is accountable to the American people while also preserving our history. Unfortunately, Congress and the American people are frequently hearing examples of agencies and individuals failing to comply with the basic provisions of the Federal record-keeping law. And most recently, in the case of the IRS, which, according to the Archivist of the United States, the agency failed to follow the law by not disclosing the potential loss of Federal records relating to Lois Lerner. This is unacceptable. A necessary part of a democratic government is transparency. The ranking member has many times said that we need to have transparency and trust. The public has the right to know that their actions of the government are taken on their behalf. At the national level, two of the most essential government transparency laws are the Federal Records Act and the Presidential Records Act. Together, these two laws ensure that our nation's key documents, whether they be by emails, maps, agendas, microfilm, or any other type of media, are preserved, sometimes in perpetuity, as a clear record of the government's operation and decision-making process. Unfortunately, in recent weeks, particularly in relationship to the events at the IRS surrounding the loss of Lois Lerner's emails, it's been made clear that the record laws were not being followed by agencies and their employees. The Archivist of the United States even testified before this committee on June 24th that the IRS did not follow the law by failing to notify him of the potential loss of Federal records on Lois Lerner's hard drive. Many will say that we have hearings and the question becomes, so what? Well, the so what today is, in a bipartisan effort, Democrats and Republicans are going to come together to make sure that we emphasize the importance of keeping these records. We emphasize the fact that the failure, the willful failure to do so, will have consequences. Records can be lost due to ignorance, inattention, intentional malice, but we should not tolerate any of these excuses, but the intentional destruction, and I repeat, intentional destruction of records in particular, is a criminal act, and the Federal employees found to have committed such a crime should be fired. I'm pleased today that we are considering the Federal Records Accountability Act of 2014. This common sense legislation will make a number of reforms to better hold the Federal employees accountable to the requirements of the Federal Records Act and the Presidential Records Act. Specifically, the bill will create a process that will require agencies to fire employees who have been found to have willfully and unlawfully altered, removed, or destroyed a Federal record. The legislation will also bar Federal employees from using non-official emails or other electronic messaging accounts to conduct official business unless it is disclosed in full within 15 days to the government. Failure to do so will be considered to be a willful and unlawful destruction of Federal records and subject to the employee to termination. Additionally, the legislation will require agencies to disclose on their website notices indicating an actual impending or threatened loss of a Federal record, and this expands the current law's mandate that agencies inform the archivist, a mandate recently ignored. Finally, the legislation will require agencies to appoint and reconfirm a senior agency official of records management. This individual will be at least at the Assistant Secretary level or its equivalent in smaller agencies and will be responsible for ensuring full agency compliance with the records law, whom Congress will be able to hold directly accountable in the event of an agency, if an agency fails to comply. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 5170, the Federal Records Accountability Act, and I want to thank the Chairman and the committee staff for their efforts in bringing this legislation forward. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Does any additional member wish to speak on the bill?
I have an amendment.
If not, the gentleman from Maryland is recognized for the purpose of offering an amendment.
I have an amendment to desk, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered.
Without objection, so ordered, but the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5170, offered by Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment.
This amendment would add the language of H.R. 1234 that I spoke about earlier, the Electronic Message Preservation Act, to the bill we are considering today. In March 2013, I introduced H.R. 1234, the Electronic Message Preservation Act. The same bill was included as a title in the Transparent and Open Government Act, a bill I introduced at the beginning of the 112th Congress as an outline for actions the committee could take to improve government transparency. This amendment would require the archivists of the United States to issue regulations mandating that within 2 years of enactment, all Federal agencies manage and preserve their email records electronically. This amendment would also direct the archivists to establish standards for the preservation and management of electronic presidential records and to annually certify that the White House has records management controls in place that meet those standards. Under this amendment, the archivists must report 1 year after the President leaves office or on whether the controls used by the President met the required standards. This amendment would move agencies out of the arcane print and file record-keeping systems that many of them still use, a system which can lead to records getting lost or not being turned over in response to requests. H.R. 1234 was approved by this committee on a voice vote in March of 2013. I hope you will once again support this common sense reform by supporting the amendment. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize myself in strong support of the gentleman's amendment. By inserting H.R. 1234, the Electronic Message Preservation Act, the ranking member is, in fact, expanding this bill to include important areas in which there is bipartisan support. The amendment would bring Federal agencies into the modern era in record management. Although all agencies use computers, few do a good job, and this would help in the capturing of data electronically. This is a bipartisan amendment supported broadly by the committee. I welcome it, urge its support, and yield back. Does any additional member wish to speak on the amendment? If not, the question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5170, offered by Ms. Speer of California.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes as the amendment is being distributed.
I thank the Chairman. I thank the gentleman from North Carolina for accepting this bipartisan amendment, which I have offered in conjunction with Congressman Chaffetz to the H.R. 5170. The American people were rightfully outraged when they discovered that the emails of a high-ranking official at the IRS were lost to a computer crash. This committee discovered that the record retention policy of the IRS was for individual employees to determine what was and wasn't a record that needed to be preserved, and to print those emails out. It's no surprise that that system failed. It's more appropriate to a time when we had standard typewriters and carbon copies than for the 21st century. In this case, the IRS managed to recover a number of these emails, but the Federal Government must have a more sensible records policy. I say the Federal Government because this problem is not just an IRS problem. It is a systemic and government-wide problem. The GAO found that email records are not appropriately identified and preserved, and that in general, Federal records management, quote, has received low priority in the Federal Government. Unsurprisingly, this low prioritization has put many records at risk. The National Archives published a report on agency self-assessment of their record-keeping in 2011. And guess what? They found 90% of the agencies had a moderate to high risk of records mismanagement. This amendment, based on the retention of electronic correspondence of regulatory decisions, the Records Act, leave that to my staff to figure out how they came up with that, that I introduced in conjunction with Congressman Chaffetz, makes sure that emails from all top-level officials are retained as permanent records to put teeth behind the National Archives' now voluntary capstone initiative. Both are based on common-sense principles that have make major decisions for a Federal agency. The public has an interest in holding on to your emails as records of policymaking decisions. It also further requires the GAO to regularly assess agency compliance and also requires the Inspector General for each agency to oversee record retention policies. I thank Mr. Chairman, again, for accepting my amendment to address this failure and to the author of the bill.
Accepting on behalf of the Chairman will be the gentleman from Utah.
I thank the Chairman, and I want to thank Ms. Spear from California for her leadership in putting this together. I was proud to join with her as she was the prime sponsor of the piece of legislation, which was identical to the amendment that we offer. It's called the Record Act, H.R. 5181, and I appreciate her leadership and joining with her on this. She thinks a very good point, and I'm glad to associate my name with it. I also want to thank Mr. Meadows from North Carolina for his leadership on the bigger, broader issue. This is an important piece of legislation, and I hope we see fit to pass it here today and bring it to the floor and hopefully be able to pass it and make it a law. I think she has adequately laid out the need for this. We have moved into a digital age, which makes this much more practical and much more needed by the government, and I would encourage members on both sides to support this amendment and the underlying bill. Yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Anyone else seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Florida.
I have an amendment to
the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment 2, H.R. 5170, offered by Mr. DeSantis of Florida, to the amendment offered by Ms. Spear of California.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes as the amendment is being distributed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would simply require agencies to automatically capture all electronic messages of senior officials, including internal instant messages, expanding the current requirement from just email capture. I think a lot of us were very disturbed when we read Lois Lerner's email that she sent to the IT technician at the IRS saying, we're worried about email. I've told people to be careful what you say because those can be searched for by members of Congress in an investigation. Is instant messaging something that can or cannot be traced? And basically the answer was, well, it can be, but the settings are that it won't be. And she said, perfect. And I don't think that's really what we want. I think we want people in the executive branch to perform the duties assigned to them and do it in a way that's transparent and that's accountable to the American people. So I think this builds off the amendment offered by Ms. Spear and Mr. Chaffetz. And I think at the most basic level, there's really no difference between email and instant messaging. They're both simply means of electronic communication. If we can capture emails, we should also capture those other sources of electronic communication. And this amendment will build on existing guidance by the National Archives that Federal records can be created by an instant messages. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I do not object to this amendment. I understand this is an attempt to ensure that agencies properly manage and preserve instant messages that are records in addition to email. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The question occurs on the amendment to an amendment by the gentleman from Florida. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment to the amendment is agreed to. The question now occurs on the amendment by the lady from California, Ms. Spear. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, no. The ayes all have it. Therefore, the amendment is agreed to. The question, if there is no further discussion, I now move
Mr. Chairman, this side, I do have a clarifying question just for us to be able to put in the record. I'm assuming from the electronic conversations here, we're not inferring from things like text messages and such, or are we assuming that as well, just for a colloquy to be able to put in the record in the conversation? So text messages included in that, IMs and such, or?
The gentleman from Florida is recognized to explain the breadth of his amendment for the record.
Can the gentleman repeat the question?
Yeah, just clarifying it, instant messages included as well as email messages. Are we including text messages and such as well, and the intent of that?
Yes.
Okay, so all included to be able to get in the record on that. So as far as if they're using a Federal device for Federal official communication, that's tracked and recorded.
That's correct. To the extent that they are trackable events, as in the example given at the IRS, they would be in fact captured.
That's entirely reasonable as a Federal means of communication on a Federal device done with Federal dollars. I think it's entirely reasonable. I just want to be able to clarify that.
Right. And on the underlying bill, if I could explain the gentleman, on the underlying bill, the requirement, if a Federal employee were to use a non-Federal entity, would remain as the policy is, that they have a responsibility to forward or otherwise bring it into the Federal system. We're codifying what has already been a longstanding policy.
Thank you for allowing the clarification.
I thank the gentleman. Is there any further discussion? If there is no further discussion, I move the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report the House Resolution 5170 to the House with the recommendation it do pass as amended. The question is on reporting H.R. 5170 to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. H.R. 5170, the Federal Records Accountability Act of 2014, as amended, is reported to the House. I now ask unanimous consent that the staff may be authorized to make necessary and conforming technical changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered. I want to note for the record, it is 2 o'clock. We expect votes at 2:40 to 2:45, but I expect that we will complete the committee's business other than the recorded votes asked for by 2:30. So I would inform all members, staff, to make sure your members are here by 2:30 so that we may dispense with this prior to the first round of votes. The committee will now consider H.R. 5169, the Senior Executive Service Accountability Act. The clerk will please designate the bill.
H.R. 5169, a bill to amend Title V, United States Code to enhance accountability within the Senior Executive Service and for other purposes.
Without objection, House Resolution 5179 will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The text has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. From Jeff Neely at GSA to Lois Lerner at the IRS, the Oversight and Government Reform Committee has discovered, under administrations of both Republicans and Democrats, high-ranking government employees engaged in behavior contrary to the principles of public service. In the private sector, these behaviors would be grounds for immediate termination, but not in the Federal bureaucracy. Under Washington, D.C. rules, we saw these employees keep their salaries and benefits without penalty. Meanwhile, at the Veterans Administration, we found that all 470 senior executives of that agency were given performance ratings of fully successful or higher, with bonuses averaging $12,000. This SES, or Senior Executive Service, reform bill will help bring needed accountability to government's executive leadership corps by allowing agencies to more quickly and fairly remove incompetent executives, individuals whose appointments have no time limitations. The bill does this while guarding against politically motivated personnel actions. I commend Mr. Walberg for his work on this bill, and I urge members' support and adopt it. And I recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As I understand it, the Senior Executive Service Accountability Act is intended to provide additional tools to strengthen accountability of senior executives. Let me first say that I believe that some of the changes the bill would make to current law make a lot of sense. And secondly, I want to thank the Chairman for working with us to address some of our concerns about earlier drafts in this legislation. This bill would extend the current one-year probationary period to 2 years, require SES employees who are removed from service for less than fully successful performance and returned to a general schedule position to be paid at the GS level rather than the SES level. Authorize agencies to suspend senior executives for less than 14 days, which would parallel an existing provision for suspending GS employees. Shorten the time frame for an agency to give advance written notice to SES employees of an adverse action from 30 days to 15 days, and allow agencies to place SES employees on mandatory leave for misconduct, neglect of duty, malfeasance, or such cause as would promote the efficiency of the service. Under the mandatory leave provision, leave would be charged against the senior executive's annual leave account. This provision may raise some due process concerns. Based on our preliminary discussions with the Office of Personnel Management, courts may view the charging of an employee's leave as a taking that would require due process before an agency could place an executive on mandatory leave. Given the short time frame we were working with for this markup, we were unable to examine this issue more closely. Going forward, I would like to ensure that the committee has the benefit of valuable input from stakeholders and experts and the opportunity to fully explore this and other important issues. In particular, the Senior Executives Association sent the committee a letter today commenting on this legislation, and I ask unanimous consent to enter it into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask that you commit to continuing to work with me to address these important due process concerns before the measure moves forward in the legislative process. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the gentleman from Michigan for 5 minutes.
I thank the Chairman. On July 11th, the Subcommittee on Federal Workforce held a hearing to examine the viability of the Senior Executive Service, and I think I could conclude from that hearing that this is not an attack on Senior Executive Service. In fact, there is great appreciation for much of the work that they do and the leadership they supply. But the hearing underscored the need to restore public confidence by increasing accountability and performance within the government's executive corps, and identified a number of areas where changes are needed in the SES system. It is important that Congress and the American people have confidence in the SES because senior executives are expected to lead their agencies and set policy, free from political influences. Public service is a special duty, and we need to ensure people are performing honestly and in the best interest of the taxpayers. Agencies also have a duty to the taxpayer to be effective and efficient in how they utilize their workforce. This includes the responsibility to address misconduct if it arises. In a budget-constrained environment, senior executives must be good stewards of taxpayer dollars so citizens receive the best value for their money. Too often we hear about senior executives embroiled in agency scandals, yet still being allowed to collect full pay. For example, Lois Lerner continued to receive full salary after being placed on administrative leave. For 4 months, she collected salary roughly equaling $60,000 before retiring. It would take the average American that works in my district or any of ours would have to work 15 months to earn that level of pay. My bill, the Senior Executive Service Accountability Act, gives agencies tools to better manage their senior executives. And, Mr. Chairman, I would just summarize the key points of this bill. Again, the bill eliminates the provision in current law that allows an executive removed for performance and placed in a new Federal job to retain their executive salary, averaging $161 base, $1,000 base. The bill makes senior executives subject to suspensions without pay for less than 2 weeks instead of simply a reprimand or admonishment. This is the same manner as other civil service workers. The bill requires agencies to provide written justifications to the Office of Personnel Management for each requested SES position. The bill extends the probationary period for senior executives from 1 year to 2 years, giving agencies an effective tool to ensure executives are productive. If the newly hired executives are not performing at an acceptable level, they can generally be fired without appeal rights. The bill also ensures senior executives receive their performance plans, the foundation of accountability for poor and high performance, at least 30 days in writing before the appraisal cycle begins. I think this is a good step to ensure the viability of SES, to continue their service to this government and its people, and I think it's something that ought to be supported readily by this committee and our colleagues. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. I'll hold the record open until the end of the day so all members may submit written statements. Does any additional member wish to speak on the bill? Does any member wish to offer an amendment?
I do.
I do.
I do.
I remember when I said that, too.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Massachusetts recognized offers amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5169, offered by Mr. Lynch of Massachusetts.
The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I do understand the spirit behind this bill. I understand that recent problems at the VA and also at the IRS and allegations of wrongdoing by senior executives at these facilities have prompted calls by many of our Republican colleagues and some Democrats for legislation that would apply government-wide to senior executive service members at all Federal agencies. My amendment would strike Section 7 relating to mandatory leave from the legislation introduced by the gentleman from Michigan, Congressman Walberg. While I fully support efforts to increase the accountability of the Federal Government's senior executive group, I cannot support doing so at the expense of fundamental constitutional due process rights. Under the mandatory leave provision of the bill, a senior executive's accrued annual leave account would be charged once the agency has decided that the executive shall be placed on mandatory leave. We asked input from the Office of Personnel Management on this legislation, given their expertise and administration of the Federal personnel laws, and they told us that there is case law precedent, with I am familiar, that suggests that placing an employee on mandatory or forced leave constitutes a suspension which triggers the requirement to provide procedural rights. In 1985, the most prominent case, which is instructive, in Loudermill versus Cleveland Board of Education, the United States Supreme Court held that public employees who are facing discipline are entitled to certain due process rights. The Supreme Court noted that these rights include notice and, importantly, an opportunity to respond, in addition to an explanation of the agency's decision, a hearing, and subsequent appeal rights. Unfortunately, this legislation provides none of these safeguards before allowing an agency to put a senior executive on forced leave, that is, to apply discipline. Given what is at stake here for these senior leaders, I believe that this committee needs to take some time to more fully understand and explore the due process implications of this bill. Mr. Chairman, I am offering my amendment with the intention or the willingness of withdrawing it if we could correct the constitutional infirmities that are contained within this bill. And it would be the height of silliness if we were to pass a bill out of this committee that is unconstitutional. I think it will be worthwhile spending additional time and making sure that we come within the comports of constitutional law. And we need to ensure that this bill provides employee accountability while protecting those constitutional due process rights. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. And briefly, we seek to fix a problem where Lois Lerner was placed on administrative leave on May 23, 2013. She suddenly retired 4 months later, successfully avoiding termination after she acknowledged the IRS wrongfully scrutinized conservatives groups for years. Ms. Lerner continued to receive full salary during this time, roughly $60,000, or approximately 15 months of an average American's pay. Notwithstanding that, the gentleman's point that any bill we pass should anticipate minimum constitutional requirements so as not to invoke a court challenge that ultimately would lead to what we could write in advance. Therefore, I know our staffs have already been working together, and I would pledge to try to find acceptable language before the bill goes to the floor.
Mr. Chairman,
I yield to the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, I want to thank you for doing that, and I hope that's acceptable to the gentleman. But one of the things I want us to be very careful with, the Lerner situation is one situation. We are legislating for a whole lot of people, and a lot of them are in my district, and a lot of them are scattered throughout, of course, the United States. And I just want to make sure that we got this one situation, and a lot of times when we legislate for one situation, it paints sometimes it can be a little bit overbearing for others, and I just want us to keep that in mind.
And I appreciate the gentleman reclaiming my time. Although this is mandatory leave, I don't want us to misunderstand. It's discretionary as to whether or not they feel mandatory is required. So this is not something where we're ordering that in all cases they must be placed on leave. The triggering event is, for all practical purposes, a determination wrongdoing. And I share with the gentleman from Massachusetts, I'm going to yield to in a moment, that we want to make sure that if there were protections in the ordinary course of firing somebody, that if you're going on mandatory leave, very clearly with a similar situation, you might well want to make sure that you cross the T's and dot the I's, and I'd yield to the gentleman.
Thank you. Just on 2 points. One is that the one that the ranking member has correctly raised, and that is the Lois Lerner case was a special case. It was not so much the inability to remove her as the unwillingness to remove her in her case. Her superiors could have made a decision much sooner than the 4 months that she stayed on the payroll if there was a willingness and a decision made at that point to remove her. So part of that was not using the avenues that were available to remove her, so she stayed on the payroll for another 4 months. The other point I want to make, separate and apart from that, is that in this bill, in this case, the rights of every senior executive employee will be post-determination. So the decision to get rid of them or put them on mandatory leave and charge their leave account is made before they have an opportunity for input. That's one of the core problems with this. There is an opportunity afterward, but at least the Supreme Court thinks that it's necessary to protect those due process rights and to apply them before the deprivation of property under the 5th or 14th Amendment is accomplished.
And reclaiming my time, I share with the gentleman that concern, and I know there's some differences that need to be resolved. But I might remind all of us that charging leave, if in fact the determination favors the employee, is a matter of giving it back administratively. Nothing has been truly taken other than an accounting procedure. So I think what's important is that although the number of days are going down and tolling, if in fact the determination, what you call the post-determination, and I know you're more of an expert on it than I am, if it favors the employee, they get it all back. If it doesn't,
but they are removed from their job. The big hand comes down, and the claw, and they're extracted from their job, and that does have consequences to it.
And I clearly agree with the gentleman. Notwithstanding that, I think all of us understand that often paid leave, we see people coming before us time and time again on paid leave, mandatory leave, et cetera. This is not that different than so often. I think we're nuancing a lot of things. Is the American people believe that if you're on paid administrative leave and you're not tolling any other leave and benefits, then in fact it's a paid vacation, even if somebody is guilty. In this case, what I believe the legislation does effectively is if you're innocent, you're on a paid vacation. If you're guilty, then in fact your days are tolling, and that provides a level of accountability that the American people can feel like if you're put on mandatory leave and it is not your fault, although you will be traumatized perhaps by being segregated for that period of time, you do in fact have no monetary loss. Well, the American people can understand that should you be found and dismissed at the end of it all, you will have had a financial loss. And I think that's the middle ground the American people are hoping. And remember, this is for the senior executive service. This is not for rank and file. These are for people who make extraordinary money by Federal standards.
If I may, Mr. Chairman.
Of course.
Those employees are forced to take the leave that they already have coming. They're put on their account, their leave account. If they have 3 weeks of leave in their because of their classification, that is immediately accessed by the determination of the agency. So they're also extricated from their job. And I don't think it's a nuance when you say when someone removes you from your job. The difference between being in your job and being out of your job is not a nuance. That's a real concrete and detrimental difference for that employee.
And I fully support the gentleman, and I realize that there are some differences of opinion. I might note for the record that a Federal employee is earning 26 days of this leave per year. A senior executive service is earning 90 days. Can carry over 90 days, I'm sorry.
These are a member of Congress?
No.
Oh.
Thanks for asking, Jerry. So, in fact, again, we recognize that any time somebody is subject to disciplinary action, the fact is we're talking paid leave, we're talking about consuming their accrual and losing, thus consuming it, only if they are in fact found at fault. If they are restored, they lose nothing and it becomes an unpaid paid holiday. If they are not restored, then in fact they are consuming a very generous accrual. I know that there's some concern about that. I certainly want to make sure, as the gentleman suggested, that we work on due process, and would ask, is the gentleman prepared to withdraw at this time? Yeah, are you prepared to withdraw?
Yeah, I withdraw.
The gentleman withdraws. Does anyone else seek to offer an amendment? The gentlelady from the District of Columbia. The clerk will read the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 5169 offered by Ms. Norton of District of
The
Columbia.
gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
First, I want to thank the Chairman for parts of this bill that recognize the importance, indeed the necessity, of due process in a Federal bill. For example, the right to appeal to the MSBP is retained. The right of the SES employee to an attorney is retained, but the notice period is cut in half, and my amendment would retain the 30-day notice period. I just want, in light of the colloquy that went on with the Chairman and my friend who's the ranking member, I just want to emphasize that the reason, particularly for the public, the reason that we're talking about due process at all, just something we wouldn't be talking about if this were a private agency, is because due process attaches when you're trying to adversely affect in any way a Federal employee. I raised this issue of the notice requirement because of the serious requirement for due process in all parts of the process of depriving a Federal employee of any part of what she already has accrued as part of her Federal employment. The notice requirement generally is for 30 days. So whatever the agency has been preparing, perhaps for 2 years, who knows how long this has been building up. But the employee gets a 30-day notice that she is going to be removed from her position, demoted from her position, whatever whatever is alleged. Now, the standard time is 30 days, and it's 30 days even if the SES or Federal employee is removed from a position which implicates national security. That's how standard and how important that notice is in Federal law today. And I think there's a reason for it, Mr. Chairman. Even the OPM cites due process as the reason. But perhaps most importantly, it says shortening the notice period. That is to say, from 30 to 15 days would not have an effect on what the bill purports to do, which is to create more efficiency in the process, and essentially concludes that what you lose in due process, you do not gain in efficiency. Consider that this is a 30-day period. You didn't know anything about the intent of the agency to remove you or affect you in any way, and then your 30 days begins. Meanwhile, the agency has, if it's acted competently, taken all the time it needs, with the help of agency attorneys, of course, to make out its case. So by the time you have notice, the agency probably has made out its full case that you should be removed or otherwise deprived of what you have accrued. During the 30 days, and that's a standard period, the employee first has to find an attorney who is experienced in the arcane, unique law known as civil service law. Then that attorney has to be free to take on the matter within that 30-day period. And during that period, the attorney has to get all the relevant documents, has to check to see that there's a viable case here, that there would be witnesses, that he can, in other words, prepare an adequate defense so as to be able to reply. Even after the 30 days, the attorney has only 7 days to respond. Mr. Chairman, this is a very expedited period as it is. And I don't believe there's any reason to cloud it with a due process flaw, and I can assure you that this flaw would be immediately raised by attorney for the employee. So I ask that my amendment be considered, and of course I would then be prepared to withdraw my amendment, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady, and we are prepared to work with the gentlelady. I know the gentleman from Michigan would like to speak briefly and to make sure that it's okay with him. The gentleman from Michigan.
I thank the Chairman, and certainly am willing to work to a satisfactory solution here. But I think we need to remember we're talking about senior executives who have much greater impact than a normal GS employee. This also is something that is not mandatory. There's no prohibition against the agency and the executive working out an extension in time. But I think as we look at why we're pushing this, I mean, the example goes back to the case of Lois Lerner and what she was able to continue doing and carrying on during an extended period of time. This provision would have saved the taxpayers just under $10,000 in salary and benefits, roughly 25% of the average annual salary in the U.S., by just carrying out this provision of the bill here. Misconduct with the executive, senior executive service entity not only affects the executive and the supervisor, it impacts on those who interacted, in this case, with Ms. Lerner, including the taxpayer. I think we need to effectively address executive misconduct. It will benefit the senior executive service. It will help restore the confidence of American people and government senior leaders, and it's a more efficient use of taxpayer dollars. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. And again, for the gentlelady from the district, I think if we work together on language that would speak to, if you will, the total of 30 days as a minimum, I believe we may be able to find common language that would grant a consideration that it would never, the total dismissal period would never be less than 30 days. However, as I've been informed by my staff, as we negotiate, we may find that the 2 weeks plus the 7 plus that, in fact, we have a cumulative period. But I agree with the gentlelady that I believe we can reach a 30-day language that will be amenable to all, and would ask that she consider working with the staff between now and the time it goes to the floor.
Well, I'd certainly appreciate that the Chairman is willing to work with us. And I appreciate what the gentleman said, particularly about the authority of the agency to grant an extension. Of course, that's discretionary. But I'm sure this is just the kind of matter, the difference between 15 days and 30 days, or at least enough time to prepare a defense. It's precisely the kind of thing that we ought to be able to reach an agreement on. So I'm pleased to withdraw, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady for withdrawing. Are there any further amendments? If there is no further discussion, I move the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report H.R. 5169 to the House with recommendation it do pass. The question is on favorably reporting 5169 to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? No. No. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that I be formally recorded in the negative.
We note you as a negative. However, the amendment is agreed to. H.R. 5169, the Senior Executive Service Accountability Act, is ordered, reported to the House. I ask unanimous consent that the staff may be authorized to make necessary and conforming technical changes to the bill without objection. So ordered. Mr. Ranking Member, if we're getting close to, I think, the amount of members we have, If you'd like to go a couple of more minutes, we'll go into the audit the Fed, but the expectation is as soon as we have what we think is all of our members that are coming, we would then have the recorded vote.
Can we just say the recorded vote is going to take that long, right?
I'm actually ready to have it now. I'm just afraid that some people might be offended.
I just want to set an exact time.
Well, we said 2:30. We'll go up to, we'll go to 2:40. So if you're not here now, be here by 2:40. I thank everyone for their cooperation in that request. Again, if you're here now, don't leave. Say that to my side. The committee will now consider House Resolution 24, the Federal Reserve Transparency Act of 2013. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 24, a bill to require a full audit of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Reserve Banks by the Comptroller General of the United States and for other purposes.
I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Oh, I'm sorry. Without objection, H.R. 24 will be considered as read and open for amendment at any time. I now recognize myself briefly. H.R. 24, the Federal Reserve Transparency Act, directs the General Accountability Office to conduct a full audit of the Federal Reserve. The Dodd-Frank legislation mandated a GAO audit of the Fed, but that audit issued by the GAO in July of 2011 focused solely on certain issues concerning emergency credit facilities. GAO remains restricted under current law from conducting a broader audit of the Fed that includes, for instance, a review of the Fed's monetary policy operations and its agreements with foreign governments and central banks. Under this bill, GAO, as the investigative arm of Congress, is allowed to conduct an audit that reviews all transactions that are required to report its findings to the United States Congress. While Congress should not manage details of monetary policy, it needs to be able to conduct oversight of the Fed. After all, Congress created the Fed. Congress has a responsibility for an entity that can create more money each year than, in fact, Congress authorizes to spend. The Fed was created by the Congress to be an independent agency, independent of influence of the United States Treasury and the Congress as well. The Fed remains ultimately responsible to the American people and its elected representatives. In particular, it is appropriate that we consider this legislation this time. In recent years, the Fed's extraordinary interventions have led some to call into question its independence. I hope we can call on all to agree that we should not need a second Treasury Department. We need a responsible and independent central bank. H.R. 24 is a strong bipartisan support with 253 co-sponsors, far more than the 218 necessary to pass, including members of this committee on both sides of the aisle. My amendment, in the nature of a substitute, simply makes technical changes to the bill and removes language calling for a separate GAO report concerning the Fed in light of GAO's work issued after this bill was originally introduced. I urge members to approve and support H.R. 24 as amended, and I recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 24 requires a full audit of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Reserve Banks by the Comptroller General that support transparency that aims to make sure the Federal Reserve is working to carry out the economic goals of the American people. But I am concerned that the impact of this bill would be to make far-reaching and unprecedented changes to the very nature of the Federal Reserve by limiting the independence that has been the cornerstone of that institution. Let me be clear. It is not necessary for Congress to pass this legislation to conduct an audit of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Banking Agency Audit Act of 1978 opened the Federal Reserve System to audit, and regular audits have been conducted since that date. More recently, Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Consumer Protection Act significantly expanded GAO's ability to audit the Fed activities. For example, Dodd-Frank required GAO to audit the emergency financial assistance provided during the financial crisis. The Federal Reserve's open market transactions and discount window operations are also subject to audit. The bill seeks to remove certain audit restrictions, such as the prohibition on auditing monetary policy deliberations. Subjecting these deliberations to audit could influence how they are conducted and potentially even the policies that are chosen, degrading the true independence of the Federal Reserve. Without these protections, members of Congress could seek to influence the Federal Reserve's deliberations in specific directions by the types and subjects of audits they request. I believe that the Federal Reserve's operation should be subject to thorough review. However, I do not support actions that would inappropriately impede the independence of the Federal Reserve to implement monetary policies and or its ability to support its congressionally established mandates. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We're going to quickly get through this bill. We're going to do the Scrub Act and a recorded vote before we leave. I'll hold the record open until the end of the day. Members may submit their written statements. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute. Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read and original text for purposes of amendment. The text has already been distributed and is each of your folders. The clerk will please designate the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 24, offered by Mr. Issa of California.
Thank you. My amendment in the nature of a substitute simply makes technical changes to the bill and removes language calling for a separate GAO report concerning the Fed in light of the GAO's work issued after this bill was originally introduced. And with that, I would yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Amash.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very quickly.
Yeah, I thank you for bringing this bipartisan bill forward to the committee. I also want to thank my friend and colleague, Dr. Paul Brown, for introducing it, and of course, my friend and former colleague, our former colleague, Dr. Ron Paul, for his incredible work on this issue for many years. I speak today as a proud co-sponsor of the Federal Reserve Transparency Act. In the words of F.A. Hayek, the more the state plans, the more difficult planning becomes for the individual. As representatives of our constituents, we have an obligation to stand up for the individual. The Fed's original mission did not include monetary policy or detailed regulation of financial institutions. The recurring crises that led the Fed's establishment were themselves caused by government interventions that kept banks from diversifying and from managing currency supply to meet changing economic demands. Rather than dealing with the underlying drivers of the panics, however, Congress created the Federal Reserve System that has since expanded far beyond its original mandate. Congress has given the Fed immense power. By manipulating interest rates, the Fed can change the value of Americans' life savings, their retirement accounts, and their mortgages. Even with all of this power, congressional oversight of the Fed is limited. We can do much better. The mission of this committee is to make sure that government is held accountable to the American people. The Audit the Fed bill does just that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. If there is no further discussion, the question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. I now move the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report the bill H.R. 24 to the House with the recommendation it do pass. I ask unanimous consent the gentlelady be able to speak briefly, recognizing that we're voting on something else in 3 minutes. The gentlelady is recognized.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank you for allowing me to speak, and I am speaking in opposition to this bill. The oversight of the Federal Reserve is important, but the Federal Reserve Transparency Act goes far beyond oversight. It blatantly attempts to influence the Fed's monetary policy, undermining the independence that economists believe is vital to a central bank's success. The Fed is already subject to several levels of audit and review, including several that were added by the Dodd-Frank Act. And I ask a unanimous consent to place in the record a list of audits and reviews.
Without objection, so ordered.
As the previous Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke said, allowing the GAO to audit the Fed's monetary policy decisions would have a chilling effect on the Fed's deliberations. It would destroy the Fed's independence and, crucially, its credibility with the markets as an independent operator that is committed to achieving the goal of price stability, regardless of the political consequences. So with that and the listing of reviews and audits that already take place, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. The question is on favorably reporting H.R. 24 to the House as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. I ask unanimous consent that the I'm sorry. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. H.R. 24 is ordered reported to the House as amended. I ask unanimous consent that the staff may be authorized to make necessary and conforming changes. We now return to the previously postponed vote. The postponed business is on H.R. 4874. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, no? No. In the opinion of the Chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. You want a recorded vote. Roll call vote is ordered. The Chair says no.
Mr. Issa?
No.
Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Mica? No. Mr. Mica votes no. Mr. Duncan? I'm sorry, Mr. Turner? No. Mr. Turner votes no. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan votes no. Mr. McHenry? No. Mr. McHenry votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes no. Mr. Walberg? Mr. Walberg votes no. Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford votes no. Mr. Mosh? Mr. Mosh votes no. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Gosar votes no. Mr. Meehan? I'm sorry. Mr. Meehan votes no. Mr. Desjardins? Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes no. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes no. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings votes no. Mrs. Lummis? Mrs. Lummis votes no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes no. Mr. Bentivolio? Mr. Bentivolio votes no. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes no. Mr. Cummings?
Yes.
Mr. Cummings votes aye. Mrs. Maloney?
Yes.
Yes.
Mrs. Maloney votes aye. Ms. Norton?
She changed her voice.
Yes.
Ms. Norton votes aye. Mr. Tierney?
Aye.
Mr. Tierney votes aye. Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay votes aye. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes aye. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes aye. Mr. Connolly?
Aye.
Mr. Connolly votes aye. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes aye. Mr. Cartwright? Mr. Cartwright votes aye. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth votes aye. Ms. Kelly? Mr. Davis? Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes aye. Mr. Cardenas? Mr. Cardenas votes aye. Mr. Horsford? Mr. Horsford votes aye. Ms. Lewin Grisham? Ms. Lewin Grisham votes aye.
The clerk will read the clerk will report. Thank you.
With that vote, sir, 15 ayes, 21 noes.
The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The question now, if there's, no lobbying after the vote. If there is no further discussion, the question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. I now move the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform report the bill, H.R. 4874, to the House with the recommendation the bill do pass as amended. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Issa?
Aye.
Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Mica? Mr. Mica votes aye. Mr. Turner? Mr. Turner votes aye. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. McHenry? Mr. McHenry votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes aye. Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes aye. Mr. Walberg? Mr. Walberg votes aye. Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford votes aye. Mr. Amash? Mr. Amash votes aye. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Gosar votes aye. Mr. Meehan? Mr. Meehan votes aye. Mr. Desjardins? Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes aye. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes aye. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings votes aye. Mrs. Lummis? Mrs. Lummis votes aye. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes aye. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes aye. Mr. Bentivolio? Mr. Bentivolio votes aye. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes aye. Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings votes no.
The clerk will suspend. So all members understand we expect no further recorded votes, but we will continue with the other bills, including postal markups, immediately following this vote. The clerk will please continue.
Mrs. Maloney? Mrs. Maloney votes no. Ms. Norton? Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Tierney? Mr. Tierney votes no. Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay votes no. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly?
Nay.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Ms. Spear? Ms. Spear votes no. Mr. Cartwright? Mr. Cartwright votes no. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth votes no. Ms. Kelly? Mr. Davis? Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Cardenas? Mr. Cardenas votes no. Mr. Horsford? Mr. Horsford votes no. Mr. Horsford? Mr. Horsford votes no. Ms. Lewin-Grisham? No. Thank you. Ms. Lewin-Grisham votes no.
Does anyone else seek recognition on the vote?
Mr. Woodall, you are not recorded. Mr. Woodall votes aye.
Does anyone else seek recognition for a vote? If not, the clerk will report.
On that vote, 22 ayes, 15 noes.
The motion is agreed to. H.R. 4874 is ordered reported to the House as amended. I ask unanimous consent the staff be authorized to make necessary and conforming technical changes to the bill. Without objection, so ordered, and we stand recessed until 5 minutes after the last vote.